For 30 years, Corbin Hayes accepted the official story. His father, a geologist named Alistair, was lost to the unforgiving Arctic during a freak storm in 1985. The government report was a sealed chapter of grief, detailing a tragic but explainable accident. But when a university's climate data archive is digitized, a long-forgotten ice core sample, Alistair's last, is flagged for disposal, and Corbin is called to collect his father's final work. As he looks at the cylinder of ancient ice, he sees something impossible nestled between layers of volcanic ash and compacted snow. A modern, machine-milled hex bolt, a silent metal ghost that proves his father didn't just get lost in a storm, he found something he was never meant to see. What follows is a story about a son's refusal to let a cold case stay frozen in time. If you find yourself drawn to mysteries where the truth lies buried, stick around, because this one goes deeper than any drill ever could. Corbin was an architect, a man who built his life on plans, blueprints, and the solid logic of physics. He preferred things that could be measured, materials with known stress points, and outcomes that could be predicted. It was a career and a life, built in quiet opposition to the chaos that had claimed his father. Alistair Hayes had been a man of ice and wind, a geologist who chased the planet's history in its most remote corners. For Corbin, that history had ended abruptly with a single, sterile telegram in 1985. Lost. Presumed deceased. Expedition terminated. He was 10 years old. For the next 3 decades, that was the foundation he had to build on. A void. He grieved, he grew up, and he learned to live with the unanswered questions, packing them away like old letters in an attic he never visited. The call came on a Tuesday morning, interrupting the quiet hum of his design firm. It was from the University of Colorado's Earth Science Department. The woman on the phone, a polite administrator with a voice that sounded like rustling paper, explained the situation. They were decommissioning an old cold storage archive. A sample from the 1985 Hayes-Thorne expedition had been found, improperly logged, and overlooked for 30 years. University policy dictated that unclaimed materials were to be disposed of, but given the circumstances, they wanted to offer it to the next of kin. Corbin felt a strange hollow echo in his chest. A sample? What kind of sample? An ice core, Mr. Hayes, she said. Core 7B. It's the last one Dr. Hayes logged before communications ceased. He agreed to come, a sense of weary obligation pulling him. It was just one last loose end. He drove to the university campus, the trip feeling dreamlike, a journey back to a past he had walled off. The cold storage archive was in the basement of an old science building, a place that smelled of chilled, sterile air. The administrator, a woman named Ms. Albright, led him into a room lined with stainless steel freezers. She opened one, and a cloud of vapor billowed out. Inside, resting in a simple metal tray, was a cylinder of ice nearly 3 feet long. "This is it," she said softly. "Core 7B." Corbin stared at it. His father's familiar, precise handwriting was on the label. A. Hayes. Site 7. 10-23-85. He ran a gloved finger along the frosty tube containing the core. Through the ice, he could see the distinct, dark lines, varves his father had called them, that marked the passing of seasons, years, centuries. Layers of volcanic ash from eruptions thousands of years ago were clearly visible, thin gray bands in the pristine white. He was looking at a frozen timeline of the Earth, and then he saw it. About halfway down the core, suspended between a dark band of ancient ash and a layer of clear, compacted snow, was an object. It was metallic, angular, and completely out of place. It wasn't a rock or a trapped bubble of air. It was a hexagonal bolt, its thread sharp, its steel surface glinting under the sterile lights of the lab. It looked like something you could buy at a hardware store today. Corbin's breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, his mind refusing to process the paradox before him. "What is that?" he whispered, more to himself than to Ms. Albright. She peered at it. "I don't know. The technician who found it flagged it as an anomaly. We assumed it was a piece of the drill that broke off and was mistakenly logged. Corbin shook his head, the architect in him instantly recognizing the impossibility. No, that's not possible. The core is extracted as a solid piece. You couldn't get a bolt inside it unless... He trailed off. Unless it was already in the ice when it was drilled. He looked at the layers around the bolt. They were undisturbed, flowing around the object seamlessly. The ice encasing it was, according to the logbook his father had kept, estimated to be over 15,000 years old. A modern steel bolt couldn't be inside 15,000-year-old ice. A cold certainty washed over him, colder than the air in the room. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. The official report was a lie. His father and his partner, Dr. Eris Thorne, hadn't been caught in a storm while huddled in their tent. They had been at the drill site, working, and they had drilled up something that should not have been there. The bolt wasn't an artifact from the past. It was evidence from 1985. Corbin looked at Ms. Albright, his voice steady but low. I need to have this bolt examined. And I need a copy of every document the university has on the 1985 Hayes-Thorne expedition. The first place he went was the official accident report, a document he hadn't read since he was a teenager. It was thin, barely 10 pages long, compiled by the National Science Foundation, which had overseen the grant. It described a sudden, unforecasted polar cyclone. It detailed a final, garbled radio transmission. It concluded that the researchers' tent, located 2 miles from the main drill site, was likely buried in an avalanche, the bodies irrecoverable. It was neat, tragic, and left no room for questions. But now, the bolt screamed a question the report couldn't answer. Corbin's next step was to find out everything he could about the expedition's funding and logistics. The university's records were a maze of old paperwork and microfilm. The primary grant was from the NSF, as expected, but Beatrice, a retired university administrator who had been a young clerk in 1985 and remembered Alistair fondly, helped him uncover a footnote in the budget. It mentioned supplemental logistical support and equipment provided by a private entity, North Star Geosolutions, a company Corbin had never heard of. That was always a strange one, Beatrice recalled, peering at the document through her reading glasses. Most of our expeditions were purely academic, but North Star provided everything: the transport plane, the modular camp, even the drill rig itself. It was an unusually generous partnership. Generous, or they wanted something, Corbin mused. Well, all they asked for in return were duplicates of the core samples and geological data, she said. Standard practice for corporate sponsors, but they were very particular about the location. Your father wanted to drill on the Western Glacier, but North Star insisted on a remote, rocky plateau to the east, said it was geologically more stable. The first thread. Corbin started digging into North Star Geosolutions. He quickly hit a wall. The company had been quietly acquired in '91 by a massive energy and logistics conglomerate called Omnicorp. When Corbin called Omnicorp's legal department, the polite but firm response was that they held no records for acquisitions that old, and due to liability concerns, they could not comment on the operations of a defunct subsidiary. The door was shut, locked, and bolted. Frustration began to set in. He had an impossible object, but no context. He had a suspect company, but no way in. He spent days searching old news archives, looking for any mention of North Star. He finally found a small article from a 1988 Alaskan newspaper. It was about a protest by a local environmental group accusing North Star's shipping division of cutting corners on safety protocols for hazardous material transport. It was a minor story, but it gave him a name: Declan, the journalist who wrote it. It took another week to track Declan down. He was an old man now, living in a small coastal town, his days of investigative reporting long behind him. But when Corbin mentioned North Star, a flicker of recognition lit up the old journalist's eyes. North Star, Declan said, his voice raspy. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. They were a ghost, son, a shell company. We could never prove it, but the rumor was they were the company you hired when you needed something moved or buried. No questions asked. Buried? Corbin asked, his pulse quickening. That was the talk, Declan confirmed. They had a contract to transport decommissioned research materials from old Cold War-era nuclear facilities in the Midwest. The official line was that the materials were going to a secure government repository in Nevada, but the routes their ships took, they never made sense. They always went north, way north. The pieces began to click together in Corbin's mind, forming a horrifying picture. A remote plateau insisted upon by the company, a deep drilling operation, an expedition that was, for all intents and purposes, invisible to the outside world. This wasn't about climate research, it was about waste disposal. His father's expedition was the perfect cover to bury something deep beneath the ice sheet, something toxic, something radioactive. Corbin felt a cold dread creep up his spine. His father hadn't just stumbled upon a corporate secret, he had been drilling directly on top of it. He went back to the bolt, which he'd had a metallurgist analyze. The report was specific. It was a 3-inch hexagonal locking bolt made from a cobalt steel alloy designed for extreme pressure and low temperatures. A highly specialized piece of hardware. He knew what he had to find. Proof that North Star wasn't just transporting barrels, but that those specific barrels were at his father's drill site. He needed a manifest, a shipping order, a piece of paper that would connect the company to the location. He focused on the logistics. How would a company get hundreds of tons of equipment and sealed barrels to one of the most inaccessible places on Earth in 1985? By sea. He spent the next 2 months of his life in the dusty basements of maritime archives, poring over microfilm records of cargo shipments to northern Alaskan ports from 1984 and 1985. It was a mind-numbing, soul-crushing task. He scanned thousands of documents, his eyes burning from the dim glow of the reader. He was about to give up when he found it, a manifest for a cargo freighter named the St. Elias, chartered by North Star Geosolutions in August of 1985. The destination was listed as Prudhoe Bay. The cargo was vaguely described as sealed drilling components and camp modules. It was almost a dead end. But stapled to the back of the manifest, misfiled and forgotten for 30 years, was a secondary form, a hazardous materials declaration. It was filled out in hurried, sloppy handwriting, likely by a port clerk who didn't care about the details. But the details were everything. The form listed the cargo as 150 lead-lined Type B steel containment barrels, and attached to that form was the manufacturer's specification sheet for those barrels. Corbin's hands trembled as he zoomed in on the schematic. On the lid assembly diagram, a small arrow pointed to a component. The label read, 3-inch cobalt steel high-pressure locking bolt. He had it. The undeniable link. The proof that those barrels, and that bolt, were there. His father and Dr. Thorne hadn't found a piece of one barrel. They had drilled into one, and when the Geiger counter on their equipment started screaming, they would have known exactly what they were standing on. They would have known the whole expedition was a lie, and the people running the operation would have known they couldn't let that secret out. Corbin now had the what. He needed the who. The name Beatrice had given him came back to the front of his mind. Silas Blackwood, the North Star project manager. A quick search revealed Blackwood was not only still alive, but was a revered member of Omnicorp's board of directors, a philanthropist living in a sprawling estate in Wyoming. Corbin printed the manifest, the spec sheet, and a high-resolution photo of the bolt and the ice core. He booked a flight to Wyoming. He was no longer a grieving son. He was an architect of justice, and he was coming to present his blueprint. The meeting with Silas Blackwood was surprisingly easy to secure. An email from the son of the late, heroic Alistair Hayes requesting a brief meeting to discuss his father's legacy was met with a prompt, courteous reply. Blackwood's estate was nestled in a valley, a monument of wood and glass that seemed to grow out of the mountainside. The man himself was in his late 70s with a full head of white hair and the calm, confident eyes of someone who had never faced a consequence in his life. He greeted Corbin warmly, offering him a drink, and spoke about Alistair with practiced reverence. A true pioneer, your father. What happened up there was a profound tragedy, a great loss to science. Corbin let him talk, nodding politely. He waited until they were seated in Blackwood's vast study, surrounded by expensive art and first-edition books. Then he slid the photo of the ice core across the polished mahogany desk. Blackwood glanced at it, a mild curiosity on his face. Remarkable, the clarity of the ice after all these years. Look closer, Corbin said. Blackwood put on his glasses. He leaned in and his posture changed. It was a subtle shift, a sudden tension in his shoulders. He stared at the bolt for a long, silent moment. An equipment malfunction, I presume, he said, his voice a little too smooth. That's one theory, Corbin replied, placing the metallurgist's report next to the photo. Another is that it's a 3-inch cobalt steel locking bolt. He then laid down the shipping manifest for the St. Elias. Finally, he placed the manufacturer's spec sheet on top of the pile, the arrow pointing to the exact same bolt. The kind used on lead-lined nuclear waste containment barrels. The kind North Star Geosolutions shipped to Alaska in August of 1985 under the project you personally managed. The color drained from Silas Blackwood's face. The mask of the charming philanthropist fell away, revealing the cold, calculating man beneath. He looked from the papers to Corbin. His eyes narrowed. You've been busy, Mr. Hayes. My father drilled into one of your barrels, didn't he? Corbin pressed, his voice cold and steady. That's what happened. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't an avalanche. He found your garbage dump, and you couldn't let him report it. Blackwood was silent for a full minute. He walked to the window and looked out at the mountains. Your father was a brilliant man, he finally said, his back to Corbin. Too brilliant. Too curious. He wasn't supposed to drill on that specific grid. It was marked as unstable on his charts. But he had a theory about a subglacial channel. He moved the rig. He sighed, a sound of ancient weariness. When the drill breached the casing, the radiation alarms went off. The security team we had on site, their instructions were to contain any breach, at any cost. The official story had already been prepared in case of an emergency, a freak storm, a tragic loss. It was cleaner. Cleaner? Corbin stood up, his fists clenched. You murdered him. You and your security team. You killed him and Eris Thorne and buried them out there. Business is not a clean thing, Mr. Hayes, Blackwood said, turning back, his expression now one of weary resignation. We did what we believed was necessary to protect our interests, and frankly, to prevent a public panic. What would you have had us do? Tell the truth, Corbin said, his voice shaking with a rage 30 years in the making. He pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket and placed it on the desk. And that's what you're going to do now. With the recording and the mountain of documentary evidence, Corbin went to the Department of Justice. The story was too big, the proof too damning to ignore. A federal investigation was launched. Silas Blackwood and 2 other surviving North Star executives were indicted. The site in the Arctic was designated a federal disaster zone and excavated. Beneath the ice, they found the barrels, many of them leaking. And not far from the original drill site, they found the shallow graves of Alistair Hayes and Eris Thorne. Corbin held a memorial service a month later on a clear, sunny day. He didn't bury his father in a cemetery. Instead, he and a small group of family and friends took a boat out onto a mountain lake, the kind of place Alistair had loved. He read a passage from one of his father's old journals, a reflection on how the earth keeps its own secrets, but that, for those who know how to look, the truth is always written in the stone and the ice. The weight of 3 decades of not knowing, of a grief without a final resting place, finally lifted. It wasn't happiness he felt, but it was a kind of peace, a foundation, solid and sure, on which he could finally build. When powerful people commit terrible acts, they often rely on time to bury their secrets. Do you think a crime ever becomes too old to prosecute, or does the pursuit of justice have no statute of limitations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and joining our community. We believe every story deserves to be told, especially those that have been silenced. Thanks for listening.